Welcome all of you. So this session is all about AZ 140 configuring operating Azure Virtual Desktop. So this session has been planned and structured from Microsoft, keeping in mind, like say, just to get an understanding about the entire product, about Azure Virtual Desktop, planning, designing, implementing, structuring, solutioning. So this course has been structured and planned, and this training is going to happen for 5 days. So before we start, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Rajesh, and I've been taking care of most of the products, as you can see, working on Azure Virtual Desktop, Microsoft 365 solutions, Azure Architect, designing DevOps, and also into the cybersecurity products. Along with that one itself, I've been coming up from the background of electronics diploma, worked into that particular field for around 5 years, and then jumped into the IT industry. And it's been more than 25 years now. I've been working with this industry itself. So yeah, that's it. That's basically a quick one from my side. Now, the next thing what I'm going to quickly discuss with you will be the schedule. All right. So this training, as you can see, Azure Virtual Desktop Administrator, this is a kind of a product which helps you to understand the Azure components, the Azure services, the management. So it's not about the product. It's basically the way you can plan, the way you can design, the way you can structure. And as it is using Azure, that means that this does requires a good hands-on when it comes down to the implementation, when it comes down to the configuring, when it comes down to the management, when it comes down to the setup. So this particular product has been designed keeping in mind for people who have been working with Azure or they've got a slight experience with Azure itself also. So yeah, all those things would be discussed in this training itself. Why? Because when it comes down to the product, obviously, yes, each and every product would be having its own life cycle, right from the beginning of initial planning, designing, and then execution, implementation, focusing up towards the availability, disaster recovery, backups, load balancing, everything. All right. So this session has been structured keeping in mind for those such administrators. So at least people who have been attending, we do expect that they are having some sort of a background in terms of uh, infrastructure as a service, a bit of containers, bit of PaaS, having some understanding about on-premises. So a bit of hypervisor itself also, not only from that aspect, and having some bit experience in terms of resilience, disaster recovery, and the backup as well also. So as I mentioned earlier itself, this training is going to happen for 5 days. So 4 days would be all technical, and the fifth day would be all about the exam preparation, as this course has its own exam and a certification as well. So let's quickly have a quick look on to the schedule for this session. Day one. Now, when we talk about day one itself, this day one is actually focusing up onto the plan and Azure Virtual Desktop implementation. Now, this module itself has got three sections, which is called Azure Virtual Desktop Architecture, in which you will be having a good understanding about each and every element about the virtual desktop, the services, the products, the integration, how they're being connected to each other, and how they are relevant to Azure, and how they're being connected to the Azure services. So that is the first lesson. The second lesson is all about the design. the Azure Virtual Desktop Architecture. This is basically is going to help you out to take certain critical decisions in terms of storage, in terms of networks, in terms of configuration, in terms of availability, in terms of load balancing. So from those aspects, you'll get some understanding about the architecture about that one. And obviously, as we have been working on the product, obviously in that case, the identities, the profiles, the services, the configuration, it's all going to be a part of that discussion. Along with that one itself, after the end of the day one session, you're supposed to perform a small lab, the lab which is going to be provided to you itself, the homework lab itself. And this is to be done before you come down to the day two session itself. So that was for the day one. Now, when we talk about day two is basically, see, when onto the day one itself, when we talk about designing and taking some critical decisions, day two is basically being planned where itself we can have some understanding about the implementation. Now, when it comes down to the implementation itself, in that case, there are various dependent components. See, no matter what kind of a product you are going to set up, obviously, there are some shared components, there are some shared services. So whether it is infrastructure as a service, whether it is platform as a service, anything, it can be. So each and every service has got some relevance. It has its own shared components. So similarly, when it comes down to the virtual desktop, we are focusing mostly onto the infrastructure as a service components. Likewise, storage, networking, and also onto that one, there will be a small piece of lab. Other than that one, there are a few homework labs for you in which you are going to do some practice in terms of setting up the host pools, session hosts, managing the imaging part, deploying them, setting them up. So this is going to be the plan of the day two. All right. That comes with the day three. So when it comes to the management of the product, obviously the identities are playing a very key role. And as you know that we have been working on Azure environment, or you can say Microsoft Cloud Services. In that case, the Azure Active Directory, which is now being referred as Microsoft Entra. So in that case, that Azure Active Directory is being discussed. Reason, identities. So identities are basically, there are different types of identities. You've got the cloud users, you have the guest users, you have got hybrid users. So other than that, we do have other identities too. It's not basically the identities can sign in and they can simply access the applications. No, the goal is basically to ensure that the security, the protection, the governance, the compliance of all of these identities are crucial. Not only from that aspect, it is also basically the one who is going to supposed to be managed. That means delegation. So every product has got two phases. One, the management side, administration. The second side, basically, which is access, the one which is going to consume your services. So day three is basically being planned to discuss all those areas and also focusing on onto the Azure Active Directory security features like conditional access policies, a bit of identity governance, talking about privileged identity management, just-in-time access. So all those sections are being covered into that discussion. Not only from that aspect, day three also includes managing user environment and apps. So how the user settings are being managed when it comes down to the connecting to the virtual desktop sessions, how to optimize them in terms of display, in terms of connectivity, every aspect. So day three is being planned for that particular contents. So here comes the day four. Now day four is basically which focuses mostly onto the monitoring and maintaining. So here itself, we will be talking about the business continuity, disaster recovery, monitoring, backup solutions, performance, health, and how you can automate the different sort of tasks as well. Along with that one itself, the day four also has a small piece of lab, the homework lab, I mean to say itself, which is supposed to be done by you guys. So these are all the technical contents what we have planned for day one, day two, day three, day four. As I mentioned earlier itself, this course is also associated with an exam and a certification. So day five has been keeping in mind to give you some exam prep sessions. So here comes the day five plan. As you can see that this course is associated with one of the exam is at 140. So if you take that exam, so in that case, what are you getting up? You're getting a certification. And that certification is basically Microsoft Certified Azure Virtual Desktop Specialty. This certification only requires only one exam. So just take this one exam and get and achieve that certification. So this day five has been kept keeping in mind so that at least you can have some understanding about what are the key areas which you need to focus when it comes down to the preparing the exam and what would be the pattern and how would be the combination of the questions. Likewise, a drag and drop, select and place, single choice, multiple choice, all of these ones are basically being talked about. And also the areas which you have to prepare. So this day five has been kept for that particular preparation for your exam, which is as good as a prep session. Now, as far as the reference materials are being considered, as you know that Microsoft has updated everything onto the MS Learn. So the study materials are all available on MS Learn for each and every course, including for this course as well. Course is at 140. So guys, that was a quick information about the schedule, and at least we know that what topics, what contents are we going to cover each day itself. All right. Thank you for being a part of that introduction. Now we are going to start with the day one content. So let's start for the day one, and we wish you a great learning experience and good success. Thank you for being with us. So when we talk about day one, so let's have a quick look onto the topics what we're going to talk about. See, day one, as mentioned earlier, that it is going to talk about plan, Azure Virtual Desktop, and implementation, talking about planning, talking about designing, talking about designing of user identities. All these areas are basically being covered. So there are three lessons, and each and every lesson has its own set of subcategories. So let's have a quick look and move down to the technical part right away. So here comes the very first part, which is being referred as Azure Desktop Architecture. So as we know that the Azure Virtual Desktop is basically nothing but a desktop and application virtualization service, and this is being running up on Azure Cloud. So Azure Virtual Desktop works. It's basically a product which is quite compatible which with all the devices, no matter what way you work on, whether you work with the Windows, whether you work with the Mac, whether you work with the iOS, whether you look with the Linux. So this structure, this section actually helps you out to understand. And this is mainly been keeping in mind basically for the people from the architect side, from the cloud architect side, from the admin side. So you can have some good understanding about the product. And yeah, here it comes up. So this lesson is going to talk about the architecture, the components, talking about the pooled and personal desktops. As we have been working on Azure, see basically on Azure itself, definitely yes, Azure has its architecture limits in terms of services, in terms of products. So the product has been designed and keeping that in mind. All right. So in such cases, say for example, if I'll just take one example of storage. All right. So, okay, what type of storages are available? What is the maximum size? What type of objects you can keep? So there are certain limits. So we are going to talk about those limits as we are going to host the workloads onto the cloud itself. Definitely the initial part is the planning. A reason you are going to deploy a workload, and that particular piece of workload needs the compute. So that means we are talking about infrastructure as a service, and at that particular point of time, the compute planning, the VM sizing. No matter whether you're working in a test environment, whether you're working in a UAT environment, whether you're working in a pre-prod, whether you're working in a prod environment, anything it can be. So the sizing, so the use case, all right. And obviously, when we are hosting a service on a cloud itself, Azure cloud, each and every service would be related with some sort of a cost. So this section gives you some understanding from that aspect as well. So right now, we are going to start with the Azure Virtual Desktop for Enterprise, first of all. Now, what exactly it is, all right, and what is the purpose of this one? So see, Azure Virtual Desktop, as we know that this is as good as the desktop and application virtualization service, which runs in Azure cloud itself, isn't it? And as I mentioned earlier itself, this is quite compatible with most of the devices, whether you work with Windows, whether you work with Mac, whether you work with Android, whether you work with Linux, whether you work with iOS, anything. So ideally itself, you can also use the most up-to-date modern browsers to access your virtual desktop hosted experiences, isn't it? So this particular module, this section is actually being structured out to help you to understand from those areas. So that is one thing. Probably keeping in mind itself. See, there are so many different use cases. Whether you talk about employees, whether you talk about specialized workloads, whether it can be related to the designing, engineering, anything it can be, right? So from every aspect, whether it is test, whether it is production, anything it can be, all right. So from all those aspects, it becomes easy for us to execute them. Now, here it's the most important part, basically, which becomes is the initial planning. It's not basically how exactly it is being done. It is basically the each and every element, how you can plan. So in that case, the very first thing which comes up is the decision making, isn't it? Why? Because until and unless we know the key requirement of those departments, whether I'm working with a support team, whether I'm a development team, whether I'm a part of management team, whether I'm a part of network team, whether I'm a part of security team, or whether I'm part of the architect designing team, anything it can be. So keeping those things in mind from the business aspects, we have to understand the key requirement that which operating system, which applications do they need. Gone are those days when people they used to sit up on the physical systems. Maybe there are some organizations that are still using into that tradition itself, but now what's happening? Everything is all virtualized. Whether you talk about apps, whether you talk about operating system, whether you talk about devices, anything it can be. So virtual desktop is basically the one which gives you a collaborative product, keeping in mind with all of these solutions as well. Now, as you can see that, which is the architecture which is in front of you here right now. So in this one, there are many elements which are being coming up from Azure. Which components, like Azure Active Directory, which talks about identities, which talks about authentication, which talks about authorization. And if you see the diagram, if you see the reference architecture, the Azure Active Directory is something, the one which also helps you to get connected to the on-prem. That means you can go and set up the hybrid. This gives you the flexibility that the corporate users can be synchronized to the cloud. And then after, they can be given an access to these services. Obviously, yes, when it comes down to the hybrid, there is again a more of a planning. Reason, authentication, authorization. Why? Because when it comes down to the identity hybrid itself, there are various different types of authentication methods which are being used, like password hash synchronization, you have got federation service, you've got a pass-through authentication. So all these things are there basically. So we will be discussing them for those areas as well when it comes down to the planning of identities as well. All right. As we have been working on on-prem, and as you can see, there are certain endpoints which are there on on-prem itself also. So a network connectivity from Azure towards the on-prem, or from on-prem towards the Azure as well. So in that case, we are going to leverage most of the Azure services, whether it comes in terms of networking, whether it comes up in terms of management of the workloads, whether it comes from the in terms of storage, anything it can be. So when it comes down to the Azure, Azure provides you a platform. That particular platform itself, the one which helps you to design, execute, and structure out your workload. And that particular boundary is nothing but your subscriptions. So that subscription is basically a boundary for any given customer. It's not that the customer is not going to have more than one subscription. No, they can have. Maybe, let's say, for example, if I'm working on different uh, environments, different departments, different branches. In those cases, an organization can have more than one subscription as well also. All right. So as you can see that in this structure, they're using one example of a one subscription, but having different networks. Maybe a network can be for the prod environment, a test environment, anything it can be. And along with that one, this network has got a hybrid connectivity with the on-prem. When it comes down to the hybrid connectivity, it again depends whether we are going to use a point to site or whether we have got a site to site, although there are multiple choices. But when it comes down to these services where itself we are supposed to have a good amount of a bandwidth with a low latency. In that case, the recommendation, the preferred, the best practice is all about express route. Express route is something, the one which gives you a dedicated connectivity, faster access, low latency. No doubt, the cost factor is there, agreed. But technically, when it comes down to the overall business perspective itself, at that particular piece of time, these things are clearly being considered. Whether it comes down to the latency, we don't need any latency. We need a dedicated connection on a level of high security itself. And one more thing which you can see on your screen itself, which is a network is having different subnets. Why? Why? Because the segregation of the workloads, maybe you're having your Active Directory in one subnet, your firewalls, your virtual appliance in one subnet. The reason of segregating these workloads and different workloads in different subnets would be there are different decision factors. Like, obviously, you're isolating them, isn't it? You're isolating them. Isolation for what? Management. Isolation for what? Security, policies. rules, firewall settings, so that at least you can define which workload can communicate to which other workload which are in different subnets. So this section is actually uh, being talking about this one. So when it comes down to the virtual desktop, in this case, there are few services which are being taken care of by Microsoft, and there are certain responsibilities which are being taken care of by the customer as well also. So moving ahead with the next section, which talks about the Azure virtual desktop components. Now, which components I'm talking about? Obviously, as I said that there are few services, there are few components which are being managed by Azure. Which are those components? Likewise, you've got a gateway, you've got a remote desktop, web access service, license service, storage. Now, what are they used for? Simple. Like if I'm talking about the web access, this is a kind of a service which lets the users access the virtual desktops and remote access and apps through the HTML5 compatible browser. And the good thing is that you can access them from anywhere, from any device. Why? And it can seem that, okay, you're working on a local PC. Along with that one itself, from the security perspective, you can go and integrate with the multi-factor authentication as well. And that too can be configured easily from the Azure Active Directory itself. All right. Now, the next component which you can see here, which is gateway. Gateway is basically the one which is acting as a mediator, which connects your users. Which users? The remote users to the apps and their desktops from their location, which are being well connected over the internet. So this is acting as a connection broker. All right. So connection broker is basically the one which manages the user's connection. All right. And along with that one itself, obviously we have got some diagnostic services, remote desktop diagnostics, which are really helpful in terms of identifying whether the session is success or failure. And why it is helpful? Yes, it is helpful. Why? Because the administrators can query. They can set up multiple queries for that one itself also. All right. Not only from that aspect, these are also quite helpful to be used when it comes down to the automation. Why? Why? Because you got a support of these products. So this was the product which is quite compatible and it is being taken care of by Azure. Now, is it the only component? No. There are few other components which are being taken care of by the customer. Now, what does the customer takes care of? As we are structuring up, as we are planning, as we are configuring the services onto the cloud, obviously the Azure Active Directory planning and setting up the Azure Virtual Network, connectivity, planning for the IP addressing, subnetting, supernetting. Obviously, yes. Why? Because see, in these cases, there are different teams which are being involved. So setting up the networks, that is also one of the key areas, the one which you can see. Why? Because we have to figure it out what connectivity methods, what different networks. So again, the same situation comes up whether we are going to set up for the test environment or pre-prod or dev or prod environment, anything it can be. And as we have been talking about Azure Active Directory plays a very key role here itself. Reason? That is a service, the one which is responsible or which is being considered as identity as a service. And this Azure Active Directory comes under PaaS, platform as a service. So you don't need to go and maintain any kind of infrastructure. Yes, the designing and the planning for authentication, authorization, setting up the identities is all to be taken care of by the customer. Why? Because in Azure Active Directory, you can have three different types of users, whether it can be a cloud, whether it can be a guest, whether it can be your hybrid. Hybrid is the one which comes from the on-prem. When I'm talking about on-prem, is basically I'm talking about the full-fledged traditional Active Directory, what we have been using on on-prem itself, right? So hybrid. If you see the other component, which is Active Directory Domain Service, so Azure Virtual Desktop, the VMs, they have to be joined to the AD and must be synced to the Azure AD itself also. And see, this is again to be taken care of by the customer. Other than that, setting up the pools, the host pool, I mean to say, for the virtual desktop, that initial planning has to be taken care of by the customer. So when we talk about pools, when we talk about the desktops, what exactly it is. So in a very simple definition, if you see these uh, pools, pool desktops or personals, these are all following under the host pools, right? So what exactly the host pool is? Host pool is nothing but a simple collection of what? VMs. How many? One or more than one. Within where? Within my virtual desktop setup and environment itself. So here. So host pools are basically nothing but a collection of one or more than one identical. When it says identical, identical in terms of what? Identical, maybe identical in terms of compute, identical in terms of services, identical in terms of applications. So Azure Virtual Desktop is actually giving you all those such solutions, but how to set up the pool, how to configure the pool, how to manage the pool itself, this is all going to be taken care of by the customer. So here itself, if you look up this reference, all right. So you have personal desktops, you have pool desktops, even right, and the users are also having the flexibility. They can modify their desktop experience. Reason, maybe I might be having some own preferences, saving the files, shortcuts, everything it can be. So personal desktop solutions, right? Which are also being referred as persistent. Now, this persistent is basically the one which helps you out to make sure that the users are always connected to the same specific session host. Yeah, so there are certain situations in which this can be done. Now, when it comes down to the host pool is basically, as I said, that it's nothing but the one which contains the app groups. So maybe, maybe let's say, for example, I've just created up a host pool for one of my departments. Let's say, for example, there is a development team, and the development team, they're looking for certain specific OS, some development tools, some development applications, some integrations, services. So in keeping that in mind from the business perspective itself, obviously you can set up the host pool so that you can have those many number of devices. You can have your required applications and you can set them up itself also. At least, at least we know that that can fulfill what exactly they are looking out for. So it can be for different departments like HR, finance, creative, or security, management, administration, or maybe there is a compliance team, there is a security team, there is an infrastructure team, there is a support team, anything it can be. So keeping all those business needs in mind, it becomes easy for us. Why? Because the most important part is basically to understand that what exactly they need. And if we are able to fulfill, nothing is better than that, isn't it? So guys, see this how beneficial And definitely, yes, it reduces a good amount of administrative overhead. Imagine a situation, and if I take you back to the decades back, where the IT people, the admin people, they had to set up everything onto the physical devices. Too many challenges, isn't it? Too much of administrative overhead. Every day, somehow engaged with some of the other activities. Sometimes the apps are not working. Okay, apps are being repaired, reinstalled. Maybe from the organization's standards, systems are not meeting the requirement. Okay, the admin is busy, involved to update them time to time. So, see, the concern is basically to highlight that, okay, we can reduce all those administrative overheads. It's not that you don't have the tasks to configure. Yes, the tasks have to be set it up. The services have to be configured. Why? Because this particular section, it does requires a very good of planning and to have each and every understanding as well, isn't it? So from that perspective, this is going to be very, very helpful. No doubt, each and every element has to be planned and structured. Okay. So now you can imagine, like say, okay, how much decision has to be taken. So in this case, the architects planning, decision making, not only from their aspect, why? Because you're involving Azure as well. So that means Azure architect, Azure designing comes into the picture. So yeah, this in this case, the idea was to just give you some understanding about host pools. So you can have different host pools. Maybe let's say, for example, I'll give you one more example here. Say there are some users from the frontline workers, right? So frontline workers are there. They might need their own setup. They might need their own set of applications, isn't it? So are you going to combine them into the same host pool? No, not at all. So keeping that in mind from the business need perspective, this is going to be a very, very important planning itself, isn't it? As we have been hosting the services on Azure, so each and every service, I'm not talking about the virtual desktop only. It can be any kind of a service. All right. It can be any kind of a service, whether it is network, whether it is storage, whether it is directory service, whether it is your database, whether it is your compute, anything it can be. So when we talk about limitations, we can say that these are some architecture limits. All right. So there has to be some configuration and the process which has to be taken care of. All right. Yeah. So as you can see that these are some of the services for which they have clearly mentioned up. But yes, if you just look up for Azure service limits, right away you come up with the options of all those components which showcases you the architecture service limits of those products. Whether I'm talking about Azure AD, whether you're talking about the storage, whether you're talking about databases, anything it can be. Similarly, if you focus mostly, if we talk about the virtual desktop limitations, see, yeah, these are some of the current ones. Okay, how many tenants you can have, how many workspace you can set up, how many house pools, application groups, how many you can have basically. Or when it comes down to the delegation, to how many people you can delegate and how many session hosts you can have in each and every pool itself also, right? So session host servers are there and role assignments delegation is there itself. So the idea is basically just to highlight that keeping in mind when it comes down to the initial planning, when it comes down to the initial designing itself, This is really helpful, guys. Why? Because if in case if we are not aware of that one, it becomes really a bit difficult for us to figure it out as well also. All right. So in these cases, it's always being recommended that you should be well up to date with all those service limits in Azure itself. All right, guys. Now, as I had mentioned that, see any kind of a workload. So here itself, I'd like to give you some example. Say for instance, if I want to go and deploy a database server, I want to go and deploy a web server, I want to go and deploy an application server. So in that context, are you going to deploy any kind of a VM? No. Any size of the VM? No. Why? Why? Because each and every product has its own benchmark. Each and every product has some best practices. Each and every workload, any kind of a workload, they've got some minimum set of requirements which should be fulfilled. Similarly, so the use case comes up. It can be any kind of a use case, as I said that. Whether you're looking for a small environment, test, dev, anything it can be. Other than that itself, you can imagine, okay, you can go with a storage optimized, memory optimized, compute optimized. You're looking for a gaming applications. You're looking for ERP based applications. You're looking for a high end database applications. So what are those? Am I going to use only one side of a compute? No, not at all, please. In that case, obviously, the good thing would be to identify which workload and what are the benchmark requirements of that particular workload as well. So if we are quite aware of that particular workload, well, fair enough. And most of the products and most of the vendors, they do provide us the configuration which are being recommended for that particular product. If in case by any chance, if there are certain kind of a products for which such benchmarks are not being provided, in that case, yes, we can see, we can go and deploy, set up with a specific configuration. And then after you can, based on to your bottleneck checks, performance checks, either you can increase, either you can reduce. So VM sizing is basically the one which helps you to, which gives you actually some guidelines and keeping in mind that okay, how many CPUs or which particular size. So Microsoft gives you a flexibility to pick and choose from the series and from the size as well. So these series and these sizes are nothing but the different use cases for different workloads. Whether you're looking for a burstable, whether you're looking for a general purpose or a GPU accelerated, memory optimized, storage optimized, memory optimized itself. It can be anything of a gaming application, which I mentioned earlier. So today, if in case if I go with one particular size, maybe over the period of time, you realize that, okay, hey, the workload which was being configured with a specific particular size is not optimized. Maybe the workload is not responding. Maybe there is a latency. Maybe there is some application latency, or maybe the loading of application is a bit slow, or the performance of application is a bit slow. In that case, what I'm going to do, you're going to work with the scaling functionality. What is this scaling? Scaling means you can go with the vertical scaling, you can go with the horizontal scaling. Vertical scaling in the sense you can go with the scale up, scale down. So you can increase the size, reduce the size of the VM. So if you have got that particular flexibility, then at least if the workload what we have planned and deployed, it is possible that the vertical scaling or Horizontal scaling can also be done. When it comes down to the horizontal, that means that we are talking about scale in and scale out. All right. So that means at any given moment of time, the instances can be increased, instances can be reduced, keeping in mind from the load impact, keeping in mind from the schedule perspective, keeping in mind from the metric perspective. So at times, the sizing, it really does matters. Maybe let's say, for example, if I'm working on a test environment, so in that situation, I might not go with a high configuration compute. So what was that case? That case was a simple example of a test environment. So from all those aspects, every key factor is to be taken care of, isn't it? So this is not about implementation, guys. This is all about a bit of planning and bit of designing as well. So right, okay, yeah, and yes, one of the other key factors which also has a very significant place in the planning and designing, pricing. Let's not forget that. Now, when it comes down to the pricing, guys, it's basically again to the customers that what sort of an agreement they're having with Microsoft. Let's say, for example, there are different types of subscriptions. You have got a pay as you go, you've got a trial, you have a developers edition, you have got an enterprise agreement. So from that aspect, the pricing, it does matters. Now, one good thing which you can take the benefit of is Azure Hybrid. Why? Why? Because that gives you the flexibility to use your own existing Windows licenses. Bring your own license. So Azure Hybrid benefits is something, the one which, if in place, if integrated, if configured, you can bring down the cost. Is that the only procedure? Is that the only way? Is that the only possibility? No. There are different other possible ways in which you can bring down the cost. As I mentioned that hybrid benefit is one of them. Other than that itself, you can also opt for the Windows 10 multi-sessions as well. So in that case, how this is beneficial? In that case, we can let more users to log in to one instance, to one single VM, rather than you're having multiple VMs, isn't it? So Windows 10 has got that capability itself in which you can take the benefit of that as well. So obviously in this case, if in case if I'm part of the cost optimization team, isn't it? So what is my responsibility? My responsibility is basically to ensure that how we can bring down the cost. Maybe let's say, for example, if I'm running with a test environment and we figure it out, hey, that test environment has been running for more than a long period of time unexpectedly, and it's hardly being used. What are you going to result into? Cost. On the other side, if I take you one more example, let's say I've got a database server and that database server is being used for the dev environment. But for some given reason itself, you have been, you did configure that database server with a high compute setup. Although that particular server is not being used that much, but yes, it is being kept up and running. Again, from the cost optimization team, they figured it out. Okay, hey, this is a particular compute which is generating a huge cost at that particular period of time. The reachability, the accountability, the responsibility becomes for the relevant team members projects. So the idea behind is basically if in case if we are deploying something, the kind of the workload, the type of the setup, the workload compute should be well justified. So the point is basically how you can bring down the cost, pricing, isn't it? And the other factor, the one which you can see is basically Azure hybrid benefit. This is the something which is really benefit for Windows servers, which can save a huge cost. Why? How it can save the cost? It can save the cost by saying that you can use your existing, bring your own license. So maybe let's say for example, if the customers are already having some pre-existed licenses for a long period of time with a long agreement, then this is going to help them to reduce the cost. The third factor, the third factor which helps them to bring down the cost, which is nothing but the Azure reserved instances. Now, what are these reserved instances? Maybe let's say, for example, I want to have a specific set of a compute which I need for a long period of time, or maybe let's say for a 1 year agreement, 2 years agreement, 3 years agreement with the same compute itself. Then in that case, you can prepay for your VM usage and save the money. So these things can be used into the combination. As you can see that, okay, the Azure reserved instances, if combined with the Azure hybrid, it can bring up to your 80% savings over the list prices. And also from the host load balancing. Now see, this session host load balancing is something which is specifically a particular feature for the Azure Virtual Desktop, which helps you to maintain and to balance the cost. How? Depending on the session host servers. How many servers do you need up and running available at that particular moment of time, depending on the maximum number of users. Maybe you want all the users to be connected to one server, and then after once it reaches to the maximum number of limit, it can move down to the next host. And that host is basically being referred as a session host. So these things, the idea is basically that is it only a one-stop solution? No, it's basically going to be a combination of all of these ones as well, right? So pricing is something which is to be also taken care of. Okay. Now this finishes up with the one lesson. The second lesson which we are going to talk about right now would be all related to the designing Azure Virtual Desktop architecture. See, as of right now, so far itself, we have discussed about a bit of pricing, bit of planning, a bit of sizing, workload structure, elements, components, which are a key part of the virtual desktop, Azure Virtual Desktop, I mean to say. All right. So what is this section going to talk about? Now this design Azure Virtual Desktop architecture is something the one which helps you to again take some key factor decisions. Among them, one of them is related or associated to the network, which you do understand that what exactly the network is, what should be the network capacity, speed requirements. Why? Why? Because when we connect to the session, a good amount of bandwidth, how many number of users, how many number of sessions, how many number of applications, services are being connected, executed, consumed. So, and also from the location perspective itself also, right? Reason, our reason is very simple, guys. Here itself, uh, if in case if you got a low network bandwidth, we do understand that where exactly it makes up an impact. So better the bandwidth, it really impacts the quality of the experience as well. So high latency, low performance, low latency, better performance. And all these things are basically dependent on the different types of applications, resolutions, configuration. So what is more important for us? Being as an admin, what is important for us? Being as an admin, it becomes our responsibility that the network planning, connectivity, bandwidth, everything should be worked out. All right. So the point is basically optimization. And depending on the location through which your Azure Virtual Desktop Service is being connected, reached. So how would you be able to come to know about the round trip time? So this section actually helps you out to get some understanding about those areas. Not only from that aspect, as you can see that recommend an operating system for the Azure Virtual Desktop implementation. Now, which operating systems are available? Whether you talk about the client servers, which ones are the best practices? We are going to talk about that one. And as you're going to set up the virtual desktop pool, the host pool, I mean to say, in that case, which load balancing method are available and which one would be used when means the business use case. All right. And as we are planning up the stuff onto the cloud itself, that means you're also involving with the subscriptions and management groups as well. All right. Okay. So the first thing first, which comes up is assess your network capacity and the speed requirement for Azure Virtual Desktop. All right. So here itself, if we say that, see, what are the elements? What are the areas which helps you to determine that okay, how much approximate of bandwidth would be used or would be required. So there are certain factors, and these factors are basically somehow related to the workload types. All right. When it comes down to the workload type itself, it's these are all being segregated based onto the type of the connection, the type of the resolution you're using up. Every factor comes up, right? So keeping that in mind, there are certain areas which we should be familiar of. So here it comes in. So workload type can be light, workload type can be medium, workload type can be heavy, workload type can be power. So all these things are basically being designed and decided based on maybe let's say for example if I'm working on a test environment and there are very few users which are being connected and not frequently they are getting connected. Maybe that can be considered as light. Some medium-sized applications, enterprise-based applications, more number of users connecting, frequency is high. So the workload is high. In that case, the recommended bandwidth at least, which says that when you go with a heavy, and if in case if I'm using some heavy enterprise-based applications which are being executed during the session itself, obviously it is going to consume more amount of a bandwidth. It's not from that aspect only, it's basically the type of the resolution which we are using up, isn't it? Why? Because that quality does matter. When a user is being connected to a session, you don't want that session to be distorted. You don't want the display to be a bit distorted, isn't it? The display should be crisp and clear with a high resolution. Now, if in case if I'm expecting a good resolution as a performance or as an end user for the session to which you're getting connected to. So idea admins have to be planning up the good amount of bandwidth. All right. And that is you can see that if they need a very 4K technology display resolution, which can expect or you can expect approximately 15 Mbps per sessions as well. So idea is that how you can gather. So in this case, we can only come to know depending on what type of users, the behavior, the purpose, the location, and the frequency, the type of the applications they're going to use. So all of these factors have to be considered before you can take certain kind of a decision. All right. Now, Azure Virtual Desktop also gives you a tool which is called a Azure Virtual Desktop Experience Estimator. This is something basically depending on from the location, from your location, from where you're going to connect to Azure, where these VMs, the session host VMs, have to be deployed. So reason from there you're going to connect. In that case, the RTT matters, the round trip time. So this particular tool is the one with the help of which at least you can determine that what is going to be the round trip time in milliseconds from the location to each and every Azure region. So what needs to be considered here itself? When you're planning to deploy something on Azure, are we going to deploy simple like that? No, you're not going to simply deploy that one. No. Why? Why? Because the decision of the region is also very important. How? Why? Because the decision of region itself would be considered on various factors: latency, cost, performance, availability, services, support. So, what are these? These are nothing but the different decision factors based on which you pick and choose. Okay, hey, this is going to be my primary region. This is going to be my secondary region, the DR region, where the workloads, no doubt, we are talking about the virtual desktop. What are they using at the backend? The session host, and the session host itself is a VM. All right. So here it's not only a part of the VM, it can be any kind of a resource. So the decision of the region is important because the planning and the decision making is very critical. So once you decide it, at least this also adds on into the initial planning that, okay, hey, if these are the regions where itself we are having the less round trip time, in that case, we can pick and choose those regions as well. Conditionally, that falls under our own requirement. It meets our own requirement. That is the biggest factor which should be considered. All right. So experience estimator is something, the one tool which is very relevant, and it helps you to get that piece of information in which it becomes very easy during the initial decision making, isn't it? Okay. Now, so far basically we have been looking to the architecture, we have been looking about the components, we have been looking about the references. So a good amount of planning. You can imagine that how much amount of the planning is supposed to be done, isn't it? In that area. Now, once you've decided into which particular region that service has to be deployed, obviously the workload, which workload? Azure Virtual Desktop. What it is going to use? Session host, the host servers, and the VDAs to which you are going to establish the session. What are they going to have? Which operating system? Which version? Purpose? So there are some recommended operating systems which are being recommended, especially for the environment. So keeping that in mind itself, if you see here, the client doesn't support Windows 8 or 8.1. So Azure virtual desktop resources can be accessed from which versions? 10, whether 64, 32, anything it can be. Choose your client on your own. Why? Why? Because when you're going to install the client setup, the remote desktop setup itself, these are some of the client operating systems which are being set it up and which are being supported, which are being recommended, whether you go with the Windows 10, whether you go with the Windows 7, anything it can be. So you have the flexibility to pick and choose your 64-bit, your 32-bit, your ARM 64 versions, anything it can be, anything. All right. So see, all these areas are coming in. And as I said that when you're setting up a host pool, so guys, host pool is basically nothing but a collection of the servers. Technically speaking up, they are being referred as session host servers. All right. So when we are setting up a host pool, now that particular pool would be having multiple host servers, multiple session host servers, I mean to say. So if you have multiple session host servers, obviously my other area would be focused on availability, performance, costing. All these factors are coming in. So let me just tell you one more thing about availability. When we talk about availability, or you can say high availability, this high availability has got two sections. One, the infrastructure availability. Second, the application availability. It's not that just the application has to be highly available. What about the infrastructure? Maybe if my infrastructure is highly available, what about the application availability? So both of them, both the requirements, both the availability have to be well planned. So when we are talking about when we're talking about high availability in context of infrastructure, Azure provides you various services. So just for your information, for the infrastructure availability, Microsoft gives you the flexibility to use availability set. I repeat it again. It is called availability set, or you can use availability zones. Now, why I'm going to opt for them? Why? Because they give you this SLA. They ensure the uptime, no matter depending on how your infrastructure is being designed. So from the service perspective, host perspective, racks perspective, blade service perspective, and having a higher SLA, that is more important. So we have got two features, one services rather, I would say that one is called availability set, second is called availability zone. So here itself the SLA matters. If I compare both of them, the Azure availability zone, which comprises of three zones, each and every zone having its own set a collection of data centers. And each and every zone is being well connected with a fiber optic with at least 300 miles distance. So each and every zone would be having a collection of multiple data centers, and they're all being well connected with a fiber optic. So in that case, will it be possible for us to split the workload in different zones? Yes. Why would we do that? Why? Because we need no single point of failure. I repeat it again. You're getting no single point of failure. So this way, at least I can achieve the infrastructure availability. What about the application availability? Which application I'm talking about? It can be your Active Directory. It can be your database server. It can be your application server. It can be your web servers. Anything it can be. So it again depends on to the type of the application, type of the workload, which availability services are available, how you can load balance them. One example, let's say for example, you have got domain controller. How do you ensure availability of the Active Directory services? So you can have multiple domain controllers, you achieve it. On the other side, okay, I'll take one more example. You've got a collection of database servers. How would you ensure the availability of them? Clustering, log shipping, availability, groups. What did I achieve? I'm trying to achieve the application availability. Similarly, you've got web servers, application servers. How do you make them available? By using load balancers. So the idea is basically when it comes down to any kind of a workload, the setup of the workload, the planning of the workload, the availability of those workloads from the infrastructure side and as well as from the application side, it has to be. Similarly, the Azure Virtual Desktop is also as good as an application. How? Why? Because within the Azure Virtual Desktop, the customer is responsible of setting up the host pools. And the host pool is having nothing but a collection of the session host servers. If I'm having more than one session host server, which load balancing. So here itself, we are talking about the application availability. No doubt, the infrastructure availability has to be in place. Infrastructure availability has to be in place. So there is additional planning. Don't forget, guys, that one. So host pool, if we are planning here itself right now, from the application load balancing, the services load balancing between the session host servers. So Azure Virtual Desktop provides you the different load balancing methods. And one of the method which is being provided by the Azure Virtual Desktop. See, these load balancing methods are within the host pool for the session host servers. So one of the load balancing method which is being referred as breadth first. So in these cases, you can determine to which servers the session should be connected first. And once it reaches down to a specific limit, the session can be hosted with other servers as well. That means you're not putting the load on every server. Here itself, you're going server by server. It's a breadth first. So this is technically speaking up, which is called breadth mode as well. Same way, if I go with the depth. So how many instances? Ideal for the cost conscious organization, the one which wants to have a more granular number of virtual machines they have allocated to the host pool at any given point of time. So if you try to compare with this one, so yeah. So you can distribute with the users, you can distribute with the environments, and here itself you can distribute based on the hosts, the depth mode in which consume, reach, move to the next one. So at least with this way, with this particular method also, you are implementing, and achieving what the application availability you're achieving with the load balancing. At least from that aspect, this is going to be very, very helpful. So, in those cases, let's go back once again. And if I talk about the breadth first, see, this is basically which is going to help you out to eventually distribute the user sessions across the session hosts, right? And the depth first, basically, which is going to help you out in which you can saturate one session host and then it can go down to the next session host as well also, right? So these load balancing methods are available. So depending on whether you're going with the breadth first or whether you're going with the depth first. So in the depth, what is the benefit of the using the depth first? Basically, is something the method which helps you out to saturate one host at a time, and then it can move down to the another host if required or whenever required. So with this, at least you can control about the number of hosts. What I'm achieving with this, depending on again the requirement. But remember one thing, when you're setting up the host pool for any given for any given host pool, you can only configure one of these load balancing methods. For a given host pool, you can't use both the load balancing methods, any one of them, which is being decided while you're setting up. While you're setting up and while you're configuring the host pools. So at that particular point of time, you can make such decisions. But the thing is basically, I can or you can only use only one method at any given point of time. So see guys, basically the overall it comes up to understand that how the structures, how the configurations can be done and being set it up, all right. And it becomes very, very convenient and handy for us to take such decisions. As we are hosting everything onto the cloud, as I said earlier itself, we are going to use subscriptions, we are going to use management groups. So let me tell you something about Azure subscription here itself. All right. So Azure has two different architectures. One physical, second logical. You must have definitely heard about them. One of them is being referred as the physical architecture. Second one is referred as the logical architecture. What is physical architecture? The physical architecture is basically in which you pick up the geography. Like say, for example, you pick up United States, you pick up United Kingdom, you pick up Australia, you pick up India. So what are these geographies? Each and every geography has its own set of different regions. Like like what? Like you got a West US, you got East US to South Central US. What are these? These are the regions. The regions where exactly you have your physical data centers. So geographies, the regions, they're comprising of what? They're comprising of the physical architecture. What about the logical one? Logical in the sense the way you can organize your resources. It's not the point that we are going to deploy the resources and my job is done. No, my job is to make sure that whatever the resources am I going to deploy should be well organized. What I'm referring to, why I'm talking about this organized. So here itself, Azure gives you a support of a logical architecture as well. That logical architecture helps you to organize your resources based on what? Based on what? Based on your branch locations, based on your environments like dev, test, UAT, prod, pre-prod. Sometimes you want to organize based on your different departments. Maybe let's say, for example, a security team wants to set up their own environment in which they have to work on. DevOps team, development team, they want to have their own environment. So what are you trying to achieve? With this, wouldn't be much easier for us if in case if you organize the resources in such a manner. So branch wise, region wise, location wise, department wise, environment wise. So if in case if we structure it out, it becomes much easier for us to manage them. Manage in terms of what? Manage in terms of delegation, manage in terms of administration, management in terms of policies, everything. Which policies I'm talking about? Azure policies. Which management I'm talking about? Delegation, admin. So from that aspect, it becomes easy. And obviously, you have got a good visibility, you have got a responsibility, accountabilities are there itself, rather than having all the workloads. One more thing which comes up that you can organize based on the workload types as well. When I say workload types means all web servers, all database servers, all application servers, all identity servers, like that. So overall, the point is basically to explain you, to have you make you familiar that Azure helps you to logically organize the resources. For that one, it has its own components. Which components? Likewise, if you see on your screen, you have the management group, the subscription, the resource group, and the resources. This is the one which you can see over your screen is nothing but the logical architecture of Azure. So you can set them up. Maybe let's have example, if I'm talking about the management group is not a subscription. Management group is basically a collection of multiple subscription. The subscription itself is a boundary, administrative boundary of what? Of the resources. And inside the subscription itself, we are organizing the resources based on the resource group. Resource group, like you can have different resource groups. One for the test environment, HR department, marketing department, development team, DevOps team. It is technically possible that you can keep all your resources in one resource group. Challenge. Challenge is what? Management, administration, security, privacy, policies, delegation. Although you can achieve them, but with a huge amount of administrative overhead. Why not to structure them in such a manner that it becomes easier for us to manage them? So what you can do, you can, let's say for example, if you're having a management group, So this you can consider as a top level. Let's say, for example, you can take one example as a region. So a region, then subscription. You can take this one as an environment. So you can go with any such combination. Let's say region first, then the environment, or how you can go with a combination of these ones as well, right? So in that case, it can be done easily. So maybe let's say, for example, you want to have a management groups with the you can say with the environment. So you know that okay, in this particular environment, you have got so many subscriptions. There is no specific one thumb rule that you have to follow this. No, you can use a combination of regions, departments, environments, identical workloads. A collection of these ones, you can structure out your hierarchy. You can structure out your logical architecture. So having this in place, at least it becomes easy. And as you can see that over the top, you've got a tenant. Who is the tenant? Azure AD is the tenant. Every customer has its own tenant. Every single customer has its own tenant as well. So keeping that in mind, again, those accounts have to be given some sort of a delegation, permission, access, everything. All right. So the idea is basically to have some significance that how easy it can be made to organize and to manage the resources. And that is how the logical architecture comes into place. All right. Yeah. And same way is basically you're configuring nothing but a location for the virtual desktop metadata. So probably itself when it comes down to the customer, Azure Virtual Desktop stores the global metadata information as well. Where? In the data center. So these things are all being stored within the data center itself also, the metadata, and the metadata is nothing but the one which is having your tenant names, your host pool names, your app group names, your UPNs, user principal names, everything it can be. So the customer will choose a region. So in that case, this again reminds us to making sure that the region which you have picked up, the region which you decide is the one where the metadata is going to be stored in the related geography. All right. So this is again a key factor which should be considered as well. All right. So guys, with this section, we finished with the second lesson, which was designing Azure Virtual Desktop Architecture. So now we are going to talk about the last lesson of this module. And this particular module or this particular lesson is all about user identities and profiles. So here itself, I would like to give you some uh, insight about the user identities. Okay. The user identities can be what exactly the user identity is. What I'm talking about here itself, we are referring to the directory service. Which directory service? If I'm working on on-prem, it is Azure Active Directory. If it is if I'm working on a Windows on-prem, it is Windows Active Directory. But on the other side, if I'm working onto the cloud, it is Azure Active Directory. So depending on where exactly we are working on, under which particular platform we are working on, so that is how we can pick and choose. See, most of the customers they have been using the on-prem Windows Active Directory, which is as good as a traditional directory itself, isn't it? Your domain controller, your ADDS, your Windows AD, it's one of the same thing. You've got multiple domain controllers which are running in. You've got group policies, you've got LDAP, you've got a Kerberos, everything which is coming in. So with that, at least we have the Windows Active Directory. Similarly, if in case if you are going with the cloud, which cloud? Microsoft Cloud Service. Whether you talk about Microsoft 365, whether you talk about Windows Intune, whether you talk about Azure DevOps, anything, or whether you talk about the Azure environment, Azure subscriptions. In all these cases, you are getting the Azure Active Directory as the backbone. So Azure AD, which falls under the platform as a service category, PaaS. So that means that you don't need to go and maintain and manage the infrastructure for yourself, for that directory service at least. So that Azure Active Directory is something, the one which is very, very relevant in terms of managing the identities, authentication, authorization. So if I talk about the user, see, when you work on on-prem, where are these identities residing? These identities are all residing in your on-prem Windows AD, and you organize them by using OUs, isn't it? Organization units, OUs, and then you go inside of the GPUs, group policy objects. And for the authentication, you are using Kerberos. For the query, you are using LDAP. So, but when you moved on to the cloud, which is Azure Active Directory, Azure Active Directory has its own mechanism of authentication, web services, SAML, Federation service, single sign-on, OpenID Connect, authorization, OAuth, open authorization, OAuth. And whereas, as in the policies are being considered, they are using conditional access policies, CAP. CAP stands for conditional access policies. There are no GPUs, there is no Kerberos, there is no LDAP, there are no OUs in the Azure Active Directory. If you try to compare them with the on-prem, it's quite different. So in that case, that it's a robust product and it is quite compatible, in which you can simply integrate with the on-prem AD itself also. And there are different types of users. So ideally itself, it becomes very, very important for us to figure it out, to identify the licensing methods, identity methods, structure methods. All right. Yeah. So this particular lesson gives us a very clear understanding about managing the identities, setting the identities, and picking up the right solutions, client deployments, RDPs, hybrid identity. That is one of the key areas and plan for the Azure AD Connect as well also, isn't it? So here it comes. So see, basically, guys, when it comes down to the licensing itself, see, access Windows 10 and Windows 7 at no additional cost. If in case if you're having the eligible Windows or 365 license, so this is something good. Most of the organizations, they are already having such licenses, so that becomes with a no additional cost. Similarly, the access to the desktops by using Windows Server remote desktop services at no additional cost if you are having the Microsoft RDS licenses as well. So overall, if in case you are having the Microsoft 365 subscriptions, if you are having the RDS subscriptions, RDS licenses, in that case, you can at least uh, have a no additional cost, and you can use those licenses as well. Also, all right. So this is the one area which should be taken care of, and this is something very important where we talk about what when we talk about storage. By the way, uh, what I'm referring up to the storage. Why storage? Right? Why? Because depending on the sessions which you're conducting, depending on the configurations which you're doing up, All right. In that case, you can have different types of storage as well. A reason now here itself, as we have been working on Azure, Azure offers you with various different types of storage solutions. First, there are two categories: managed or unmanaged. Managed in the sense the storage is being managed by Azure. Unmanaged, unmanaged is being taken care of by customer. So there are certain responsibilities against that storage depending on the type which you go for. If I go with the managed, Azure takes the responsibility in terms of availability or the backup, the security. And if it's unmanaged, the unmanaged storage has to be managed by the customer. So the customer can decide the replication, availability, backup, security, filtering, firewall, access. So there are two different types. One, managed, second, unmanaged. So both the cases are there itself. So in those cases, ideal itself, in many cases, if I talk about Azure Virtual Desktop, we are talking about the profiles. So obviously in such cases, the profiles storage, you can store your profiles, your profile containers, and for that itself, you're using FS logics, all right, to set up the profiles, to store the profiles. Likewise, for example, if I'm using a roaming profile, at that particular point of time, these profiles is immediately available and appears into the system exactly as a regular standard user profile. So when a user signs in, the container is dynamically attached to the environment using the natively supported hard disk, VHD or VHDX. And the user profile is immediately available and appears exactly like a native user profile. So if we talk about from the storage perspective itself, Azure also has different uh, choices. You've got Azure files, you've got Azure NetApp files, you've got storage spaces directs, right? So there are different use cases, and these use cases, they do differ in terms of region-wise support, services support, redundancy, tiers and performance, everything, capacity, and also from the management perspective as well. All right. Same way, if in case if I'm talking about desktop client deployments, see, so how many pools you're having in this case? In this example, they are using two different pools, pool A, pool B, and probably in one case you're using the pooled, in another one you're using the personal itself also, right? So to do two different approaches depending on the different departments. All right. So maybe the sales and engineering or frontline workers, anything it can be. All right. So what are you setting them up? You're creating nothing but the application groups which are a part of associated to that host pool. And this application group is nothing but the one which contains your desktops, the virtual desktops, and the virtual applications as well. All right. So different pools as well coming up. As far as in case if I'm talking about RDP, see, we do have the remote desktop web client, and you could have a web version itself also, right? Which uses a compatible web browser to access what? To access the remote resources, depending on what has been given and access to you. So remote desktop web client is also available. As we have been talking about identities, all right. So see, in this entire section, hybrid is what? In general, hybrid is a very generic term. We have to clearly understand that which type of the hybrid are we talking about. whether it is identity is a hybrid, network is a hybrid, or you can say storage is a hybrid, monitoring is a hybrid, backup is a hybrid, disaster recovery is a hybrid, anything it can be, anything. So here itself, we are going to talk about hybrid identity with the Azure Active Directory. So to connect, this allows us to connect the on-prem Active Directory to the Azure Active Directory. Reason? Why? Because the customers have got a flexibility to take their corporate users from the on-prem to the cloud. And then after, they can go and decide what they can decide. They can decide that to give them the delegation and to give them the access to the services, consume. So whether they are going to be used in terms of management of the service or whether they are going to use to access the service, anything it can be. So hybrid identity is very, very important. There are various other business use cases in which identity hybrid becomes one of the major base use case. It has to be there. So when it comes to the hybrid identity, one of the other factors which comes into the place in terms of decision making is which authentication method. So how many authentication methods you can see? You've got three: federation service, pass-through authentication, password hash synchronization. So if I talk about password hash synchronization, this password hash synchronization, that means from your on-prem Active Directory, the password hashes can be synchronized to the Azure AD. Why? Why? Because onto the on-prem AD in your Windows Active Directory, the passwords are stored in the hashing method. So with that, you can achieve a same sign-on. Same sign-on means the users, they can sign in with the same credential onto the on-prem and the same credential onto the cloud. Yes, the authentication happens twice. One at the on-prem if he logs into the on-prem, and if he logs into the cloud, the Azure AD authenticates. So this is something with the one which is one of the most simplest method to set up. On the other side, if in case if I'm looking for a single sign-on solution, pass-through authentication gives it to you. So in the PTA stands for pass-through authentication, in which you are not synchronizing the password hashes. You're just synchronizing the identities with the help of Azure AD. With the pass-through authentication itself, you're having an agent on the on-prem. Which agent? The PTA agent, which acts as a mediator. So if configured, the users who tries to log into the cloud, they are being, for their credentials, they are being validated from the on-prem. So it is also quite easy to set up. It's not that too challenging. But the thing is that when you set up the PT agents, it has to be at least two of them, minimum two, for the availability. And they're being load balanced by itself. All right. So on the other hand, if in case if I'm looking for a federation where itself the users are being redirected for the authentication. So in this case, there are two redirections happening. One, for the authentication, the user is being redirected from the cloud to the on-prem, and after getting successfully validated, authenticated, they are being reverted, they are being redirected back to the on cloud Azure AD. So federation itself, it is using TLS, which does requires a certificate. Whereas if in case if I'm talking about the pass-through, password hash, they don't require any certificates separately. It's all inbuilt. But on the other side, the federation, it does require a separate certificate as well. So the idea is basically to understand if in case if you're setting up the hybrid identity, pick and choose your relevant authentication methods. So if you see on your screen, these are some of the comparison methods, depending on the decision making, right? whether to be managed onto the cloud, whether you want to synchronize, whether you want to go with a combination, right? So in some cases, you can go with the options. You can go with the combinations of them as well, also if you want to. All right. Okay. This way, it becomes very, very easy for us to set them up. So ideally, see, basically, I'll just take you back once again to the previous screen. So these are the three areas which we talked about. All right. Password hash. This is again a sign-in method that synchronizes the hash, isn't it? Which we talked about. Pass-through we talked about. Federation we talked about. So the setup and the services have to be configured, and the architecture has to be designed well. So if I try to compare all these three, the one which requires too much of administrative setup, which is none other than your federation service. All right, with this one here. Okay, guys. So with this itself, we have almost reached towards the end of the last lesson of this module for the day one. So before we end of the session itself, guys, let me give you a quick recap about what exactly we talked about, what exactly we discussed. The idea of this particular day one session was to make you familiar with the section of having an understanding about the architecture, right? Getting some decision factors, implementing them, structuring them, understanding the components of the Azure Virtual Desktop. As we have been working on Azure itself, it becomes very, very critical for us to plan, design, structure in terms of VM sizing, compute, billing, cost optimization methods, limits, talking about architecture components of Azure Virtual Desktop, which is being taken care of by Azure, what are being taken care of by the customer, keeping in mind and consideration in terms of bit of storage, networking, subnets, connectivity, network latency, optimization. All right. So the idea was to basically to understand all of these sections, and also in terms of identities, what different types of identities are available, whether it is cloud, guest. Guests are basically externals, right, from the different organization. Even they can be given an access, and hybrid, which becomes the on-prem. And when it comes down to the hybrid, it becomes a key factor for the authentication methods, in which we discussed about these three, which is password hash, pass through, federation. So when it comes down to the setup, yes, they do have their own process of configuring, but at least you have some understanding about the product. So implementing these authentication methods, it's very, very important. All right. And for the identity synchronization, they're using Azure AD Connect. I repeat it again. They're using Azure AD Connect has to be configured. So Azure AD Connect can be configured as Express or Advanced Custom. So which gives you the flexibility to pick and choose the authentication methods. Otherwise, if I go with the Express setup, it uses PHS, password hash synchronization by default. But if you go with the custom advanced setup for the Azure AD Connect, it gives you the flexibility to pick and choose your different authentication methods as well. So guys, with this discussion of these topics, we are coming towards the end of the day, and I hope you learned, you're taking back something with you. And obviously, we have already mentioned up there are a few homework labs which are supposed to be done by you guys. So make sure that you take out some time and to perform them itself. Lastly, I would like to say thank you to each one of you who had been attending this session for the past 2 hours. And thank you for being patient, listening me actively, and giving your attention as well also. So once again, thank you guys so much to all of you. With this, we are coming and ending up with our day one session. Tomorrow we are gonna come back again with the day two session as well also. So till then, I'd like to say goodbye and